when she gave the Lancaster House speech, and there were lots of sort of hostages to fortune in that speech, were her and her team absolutely clear of the implications of what they were saying? I mean, had this been properly thought through, or was this just a slightly sort of naive positioning for political and internal reasons? That wasn't meant to sound
I mean, it's a difficult question for me to answer because I wasn't working for it at that point. So my own view is that I don't think there are huge hostages to fortune in Lancaster House. I think if you read back Lancaster House, she certainly had to compromise a bit on it. I think that the speech that is more problematic is the conference speech. And I have a lot of, so whilst I, if I had been there, I think I would have toned that down a bit. I have a lot of sympathy for why it was done, and you touched on it very well, I thought, in your introduction, which is you had this leadership election, and essentially Boris Johnson and Michael Gove took each other out, and then Andrea Leadsom took herself out. And so Theresa became leader without really having to fight a contested election. And if let's say it probably, I don't know, you think it probably would have been Boris versus Theresa. Yeah. If those events hadn't happened, I think that probably would have been the runoff. And then one of two things would have happened. Either he would have beaten her and she would have been a senior minister in his government, or if she'd won, she would have had authority with the party and the Parliamentary Party for having defeated him in front of the membership. So I think it was perfectly natural that having won the leadership in the way that she had, and having campaigned, albeit not in a sort of George Osborne way, for Remain in the referendum, she felt the need in that conference speech to reassure Brexiteers that she understood the things that were important to them. So I can see why it was done, but I think what Graham said in his introduction, paraphrasing him, is right, which is that built up a level of expectation that she was then measured against by that wing of the party.
Anyone else want to come in?
I'll come in. Yeah. So I think one of the sort of very tricky things in the post-referendum period is that essentially the government is confronted with an enormous trade negotiation, which is not something the government is used to doing because for the last 40 years the EU had done it for us. And that is immensely difficult. I think if there was a slowness to recognise something in particular, and I mean it's not specifically about Theresa May but about this period, it's to really understand how difficult Northern Ireland was going to be and how much of a challenge the border was going to be. And you can trace that back to the campaign. It's one of the things we sort of try to outline the absence of it, if that makes sense, in the book, that there were a small handful of people who tried to draw attention to this, but actually UK politics is in general used to ignoring Northern Ireland. It was very difficult for that to get traction, and it's only really later that people start to understand just how far this is going to drive the whole story.
We also do an analysis of the debates, don't we, on the referendum bill. And Northern Ireland, the impact of Brexit on Northern Ireland is never mentioned. Northern Ireland is only ever used with respect to the date of the election and whether it's going to clash with the dates of the Northern Ireland Assembly elections or some such. And Article 50, I think in those entire debates, is mentioned once by Cheryl Gillan, who was one person who did understand it. And if the triggering of Article 50 had been written into the referendum bill, that a lot of nuisance could have been saved on the other side of the referendum. But even that wasn't done in terms of having a plan.